What if I told you a lot of Australians want to leave the lucky country? Should it scare you? What's going on? My name's Jack, a 30-year-old Australian living and working in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I moved from Sydney about 3 years ago, and living in Asia has given me a different perspective of the world and particularly what's going on in Australia. I came across this viral video on the How Money Works channel, and I thought it would be great to give my insights, particularly with what's been going on in the world economy and politics over the last few months since this video was published. My last reaction video got a lot of interesting comments from Australians, so hopefully I can address them in this video. Not that studying at uni makes you a better person, more intelligent or more knowledgeable, it certainly doesn't, but I do have a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Sydney, majoring in accounting and finance. And I've also worked in the finance industry in Australia for myself and also in Malaysia for the last 9 years. So hopefully I can give some valuable insights and share my opinion. Let's go. I haven't watched this video before, so we're going to be watching it together. I'll pause the video and leave my thoughts whenever I have anything. Otherwise, I'll let the video run.
Staying on top of all the developments in finance, business, and economics can be exhausting. Between everything becoming an excuse to gamble, corporate consolidation of markets, and political influence driving huge asset bubbles, causing extreme wealth inequality, spiraling consumer debt, and diminishing savings, stagnating wages, unaffordable real estate, and generational wealth divides, all string tied together by...
There's a lot of topics covered there. Clearly this is going to be an economics-based video from an American. So I was looking from an American's perspective about Australia. He's raised a lot of different points there, such as the different generation divide. We know that the boomers are the ones sitting on the wealth, and the Gen Z or the younger people are having a tough time. At least that's what the media says. So I think that's the angle it's going to be looking at Australia from.
Questionable government programs is enough to get pretty depressing. But just remember, it could be worse. We could be Canada. And if that wasn't bad enough...
The US and Canada are going at it again right now with the tariffs, so that's going to be a theme throughout the video as well.
Somehow there is a country that is pushing these issues even further, and as a warning for how bad things could get, has managed to hold on for now. Let's call it Canada with snakes.
That's quite interesting. I've heard a lot of similarities between Canada and Australia, even though we're on the opposite side of the world, have very different weather. The people and the economy and what I'm hearing about what's going on, there's very similar themes. Very expensive house prices in Vancouver, Toronto, immigration concerns, other cultural differences that are changing the countries. Also similar size in terms of land mass and population. This comparison does make sense to me.
Around 200,000 electronic poker machines, known as pokies, fill bars, pubs, clubs and casinos.
Capping losses at $100 a day and $5,000 a year.
In Australia is officially the worst on record, with the average property costing 8 times the median household income.
So the biggest issue in Australia at the moment is the housing unaffordability and lack of stock for people to live and rent. And also interesting, they touched on gambling as well. I have a lot of thoughts on that. The government's basically trying to price casinos out of Australia as an industry.
Sydney's rental market has gone from bad to worse, with prices continuing to soar.
With Revelation's taxpayer money is being used on drugs.
Every year, up until its downfall, Credit Suisse would prepare a report that looked at how wealthy the people of the countries around the world were, instead of just looking at GDP per capita, which calculates how much the average person in an economy produces in market output every year. This report attempted to calculate the net worth of those people to see how good they were at accumulating wealth over time. Someone with a high income that is spending everything they make on rent and overpriced food isn't going to grow their wealth as quickly as someone who has a more modest income but is paying off their own home and is investing diligently into retirement accounts.
That's correct. So this is what I touched on in my last video reacting to Nomad Capitalist. One of the reasons your lifestyle might be better if you were to move to Asia or a lower cost of living country is that even if you're earning less money, you can also be spending a lot less and therefore saving a lot more and therefore investing it in assets that go up in price over time, therefore growing your net worth. To define it is assets minus liabilities. So if you own a home worth $1 million, but you have an $800,000 mortgage on it, your net worth for that asset is $200,000.
I like to call this the San Fran Tech Bro conjecture. But according to these annual reports, the Australian people always looked like the second group of slower, more deliberate wealth builders. Their raw income isn't as high as here in America, but they were consistently some of the wealthiest people on the planet. UBS recently released the 2024 report, and once again, Australians had the second highest median net worth on the planet.
That's the stat I was talking about in the previous video as well. I know it's shocking for Australians to hear this, but geographically, we are isolated from the rest of the world. Mentally, economically, and perspective-wise, a lot of people are also very isolated. The reality is Australians earn relatively high incomes and they're able to acquire assets that have grown historically over time. Most of this is tied up in property. But overall, after taking everything into account, including the cost of living, the wealth that Australians have managed to acquire, in this case, the median, the middle person, is the second best in the entire world. If you think you're struggling, pretty much everyone else in the world is struggling more. So perspective does matter. Australians in general are very wealthy, which gives you options and opportunity to explore the rest of the world, geo arbitrage, and see what your net worth in Australia can get you somewhere else, which I'm suggesting is potentially a better lifestyle for you in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe.
They only fell behind Luxembourg, which is a European micronation which you are probably not in the tax bracket to even be aware of. The fact that this report tracks the median instead of the average net worth is also really important. This means that the Australian right in the middle of a lineup from the richest to the poorest is more than twice as rich as an American in the same position.
This is a common objection and what people were saying in the comments on my last video. It's the median, not the mean. The mean is the average, which means if there are a lot of wealthy people, politicians, billionaires, that would pull the average up and therefore not represent the true average Australian. In reality, that's not the case. We're talking about the median. So if you line everyone up, we're talking about the middle person, which is an accurate representation of what we're trying to portray.
The report also includes a generic average where America does have a slight edge. But all that really tells us is that we have an inequality problem with a small group right at the top massively dragging up the average at the expense of everybody else in line. Considering all of this, the title of this video might not make much sense to you. Anybody would be lucky to be Australian, right? Well, yes and no. And lucky really is the important word here.
Yes, you are lucky to be Australian. I'm lucky to be Australian. I don't take it for granted. I do love Australia and a lot of things are going well, but it doesn't mean everything's perfect. And what we're focusing on is the future. If we keep going in this downward trajectory, where are we going to be in 10, 20 years time? What's Australia going to look like for your children? Are the golden days over? That's the question we're asking here.
Australia has become so wealthy by getting lucky in just a few key industries, and then by going all in on keeping those industries alive by any means necessary, including its own long-term viability. Of course, the most obvious place where this has happened is in the country's outrageous real estate market, which makes even the most overpriced cities in America look downright affordable by comparison.
This is a really good graph. Housing affordability in median price to income ratio. So this takes into account the incomes earned in a particular city and then looks at the average price of those houses. There is a lot of nuance to this. For example, houses in Sydney are typically a lot larger than the rest of the world. So if you account for per square meter, this starts to look quite differently, but nonetheless, it's still a good indicator. Anything over 9 is rated as impossibly unaffordable. Sydney's at 13.8. So a lot of people, a lot of young people are struggling to buy a house.
But housing is actually only just one symptom of much bigger structural problems that the country has been quietly trying to ignore. There are lots of people that look like they are happily building wealth in Australia, and there are even a lot of people becoming extremely wealthy. But the different ways to actually obtain that wealth are very narrow. The key to Australian wealth is dirt. Either digging it out of the ground to export as unimproved natural resources or by selling it back and forth to one another.
The Australian economy is housing, iron ore, gas, oil, other commodities. We dig it up, we send it overseas. We don't manufacture, we don't value add within our shores, we send it overseas. For example, a lot of natural gas goes straight to Japan, a lot of iron ore goes straight to China. So China is our biggest trading partner, and with the tariffs that have recently come in across the board, China, the US going at each other, how is that going to impact Australia? I think it's going to be significant because it's going to affect demand of iron ore from Australia, which is used to build steel in China, which is then used to export products or build their infrastructure. So any global trade war will impact Australia, and some Australians just may not know what's coming because we have no say over this. We dig the dirt up, we send it. If the price goes down, if China stops buying, we can't do anything about it. We don't have leverage. At least the US has leverage politically and economically.
Economic complexity ranks a country's exports based on how varied they are and how unique they are to that country. A country that exports a wide variety of highly unique products that only it produces would have high economic complexity. A country that only exports a few goods that lots of other countries also export would have low economic complexity. Australia has the lowest economic complexity of any high-income country in the world.
Yeah, so this is correct. So this is saying what I just said. So Australia primarily exports iron ore, oil, gas, and gold. Gold has been doing well recently, so that's good. But other than that, economic complexity, very, very low. We don't manufacture anything complicated. We don't have a wide range of goods and services across different industries to export to other countries. It's very concentrated, which also means we're very vulnerable to shocks to those industries from different geopolitical events around the world. And for those who made comments about Malaysia, Malaysia has a more complex economy than Australia. Malaysia actually manufactures semiconductors and other technological inputs to the rest of the world economy, which also happen to be exempt from tariffs because they're important to the global economy and technological advancement, and it's seen as a critical industry for America and also for China.
Ranking 102nd out of 146 total countries included in the survey. Data has been falling consistently since the 1950s, when it was in the top 30 thanks to a combination of manufacturing as well as research and development coming out of the country. But today, this puts it behind places like Uganda, which have a more varied export base than Australia.
He just mentioned that it's changing a lot. So Australia used to be more complex. We used to have a different economic system, and it's changed, doubled down on what's working, the iron ore, the property, the education. But how long does that last for? What does that look like going forward? You have to question the consequences of doing that.
It now depends almost exclusively on selling natural resources and livestock to growing economies in Asia because it just doesn't make financial sense to focus anywhere else.
So Australia has strong ties to Asia economically. We rely on Asia buying our products. So don't be scared of Asia. You might like living here too.
Having such a resource-dependent economy means investors have to decide between funding new innovations that could improve the world, or at the very least, provide sustainable cash flows, or they could invest into developing more mines to export more resources to an existing list of willing buyers. The second option has just been a much safer bet for decades, which means that the country has some of the most advanced natural resource extraction in the world, but is severely behind in other areas of innovation like technology.
Yeah, that's right. So the reason why Australian resources are very attractive to countries in Asia is first geographic location. We can ship iron ore from Western Australia, from Perth and up the west coast to China for much cheaper than a lot of other countries can. It's cheaper to go from Australia, China than it is from Africa to China. So we're going to have lower cost iron ore, and we're very efficient at doing that. But that means that investments, royalties, taxes taken from there, if they're not reallocated into technology, into AI, we're just not going to be competitive in that arena, and we're not.
And advanced manufacturing. In some tragic irony, the Australian government itself has helped to fund a lot of scientific research resulting in advancements in solar panels, the advent of Wi-Fi, modern medical tools, and even Google Maps. Any of these alone would be a major contributor to the country's relatively small population. But when it came to actually commercializing these technologies,
yeah, that's what I was going to say. Australia does have great research, and we've come up with a lot of awesome things. We have good scientists, we have good forward vision research on some things, but in terms of commercializing it, it usually gets sold, it usually gets outsourced to other countries, US or Europe or Asia, and they commercialize it and end up taking it to the long term. So I think a lot of Australia, maybe from the government, has a short-term view on a lot of things, whereas if we had a longer-term view about building sustainable, innovative industries, maybe Australia would be in a different place, and it's not too late.
The country lost out because its dependence on natural resources undermined its business environment. Investors would rather the safe, predictable option, and so these technologies naturally moved to where they could find funding from other sources that were willing to take a risk. Unfortunately for Australia, this actually just ended up making their investment markets even more risky. For a long time, the Australian dollar was almost perfectly correlated with natural resource prices, which meant Australian investors were resource investors whether they liked it or not. This price connection has decoupled since COVID, but that itself is probably not a good sign. It could actually be the biggest indication that Australia has dug itself into a hole, both literally and figuratively, that it's going to be almost impossible to get out of.
It's still very highly correlated. So recently, in the week prior to me filming this, we just had the big stock market crashes from Trump's Liberation Day. And what we've seen is the oil price go down, iron ore has gone down, and the Australian dollar crashed almost 5% against the US dollar in one day, now down at 60 cents per US dollar. So the Australian dollar is heavily linked to commodity prices, which is not necessarily a bad thing because it acts as a hedge. So if commodity prices fall down, the Australian dollar falls further, which means that our exports are still competitive on a relative basis to other countries. Whereas if our dollar did not go down, our goods would become more expensive and foreigners would stop buying them.
Without giving up a lot of the wealth it's become accustomed to. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how long Australia can keep getting away with it. There are dozens of serious problems just under the surface in Australia that you might not think of much by themselves. But together, they changed the optics of the country from a thriving and vibrant economy to a place living on long borrowed time. One of those issues is gambling. Sports gambling, online casinos, and market wagering has become one of the fastest growing industries here in America since regulations were loosened in 2018. Since then, billions of dollars have been piled into...
This is a really interesting topic. Gambling culture is huge in Australia, particularly sports, has been far more liberal in Australia than it has been in the US. Only recently have certain states opened up online sports betting, which has caused a boom in these states, but Australia's had this for a long time. The Australian government has been clamping down on online sports betting advertising recently, but in general, I would say gambling is a significant pastime for a lot of Australians with a bit of spare money, and even if they don't have spare money, they can get into debt.
Encouraging people to bet on basically anything. The rush to acquire customers has become so extreme that a lot of these companies aren't even running their online casinos at a profit because they are reinvesting as much as they can into growing their customer base as fast as possible. The reason why investors don't mind burning billions of dollars in a highly risky industry with serious regulatory risks is because of Australia. Australia is living in the future when it comes to gambling, and that future is bleak. According to their own government inquiries, Australians lose almost $1,000 per person every year through different forms of betting. That's inclusive of a large share of the population who don't partake at all. So the losses of the average Aussie punter are statistically far worse.
True, but I will take the libertarian aspect on this particular issue. I think it's people's responsibility with what they want to do with their own money. If they want to be able to gamble, they should be able to gamble.
Australia has a deep, wide, and highly entrenched gaming industry. The average Australian pub operates like a mini casino complete with a small selection of electronic poker machines.
So this is the problem, because we have big casinos in Australia, only one per state, so there's big monopolies on this. There's one casino license in each state. For retail gaming in New South Wales, which is where Sydney is, you have Star Casino, which probably won't be around much longer, and you also have Crown Casino, but it's only for the VIPs, high rollers. And they're packed with poker machines, which make a lot of the money, but they've introduced laws recently, the New South Wales government, to basically shut it down without removing the license. So they've added carded gaming, which means if you want to play the pokies, if you want to just gamble a little bit at the casino, the average person, you have to sign up, do all these documents, have your ID. It just makes it a whole big hassle. Whereas before, you used to be able to walk in, show your ID, boom, and you can just put cash on the table and gamble. So that's what Las Vegas is like, that's what Macau is like, that's what the rest of the world is like. But if you think Australia is open for casinos, you would be wrong. They're wiping it out or making it economically unviable to operate a casino. Whereas all these pubs and clubs, which are very common, pub culture is huge in Australia. They go to the pubs and then you can bet much easier with less restrictions in a pub versus a casino. So because the pubs are popular and a big source of revenue for the government, they're not going to crack down as hard on them. They're just going to go after the big ones, the casino, shut that down. That's politically favorable for them because they look like they're doing something. Whereas the real problem where the money laundering is going on and where people are losing their money is actually the regular bettors at the pubs.
Betting on sports is commonplace. Horse racing is a major tradition that even has its own public holiday. Novelty betting markets has been a major thing there for decades, and this is all on top of more traditional gambling like lotteries, casinos, and scratch-offs. Back here in America, the venture capitalists have done the math and have figured out if they can replicate Australian-style gambling in a market as big as ours, then they can stand to make trillions. Australia is also a great business test case against the risk of regulation. Unsurprisingly, the sheer market penetration of gambling in Australia has caused problems for at-risk individuals, largely young men. On top of the financial consequences of losing thousands of dollars every year, the country has an epidemic of related issues like fraud, petty crime, and violence stemming from unhealthy gambling. The public also largely hates how prevalent gambling is pushed on them.
That's true, and it touches on the safety component here. So when we talk about safety and when I talk about how safe Kuala Lumpur is at night and at different Southeast Asian cities, one of the reasons why I think it's a lot safer here in Kuala Lumpur is because there's a lot less alcohol, there's a lot less gambling. When people go out, they have a bit to drink, they gamble, they lose money, they get aggressive, crime happens, it's not safe. So if you've been in the middle of Sydney at night around drunk people, if they've lost money, not a good place to be.
Easy to get the political support to pass laws to moderate the reach of this industry. Right? Wrong. All of these companies employ lots of people, and they spend a huge amount of money on fear-mongering the job losses that would come if a local bar couldn't have a casino floor stapled onto it.
But they're fine to go after the star casinos because they only employ a few thousand people. It's one big entity. If they can take that down, they get the political bonus points, but they also have to sacrifice a few thousand jobs. Whereas if you went after all the thousands of pubs and clubs around Australia, you'd be losing hundreds of thousands of jobs, and that would have political kickback. So they're just choosing their target. It's not about the ethics, it's not about the gambling, it's about keeping the money flowing into the government coffers while also getting political brownie points, in my opinion.
For any of you who haven't been to Australia, you might think I am joking. I am not joking. Australia has been extremely soft on regulation, and while gambling by itself is not single-handedly going to take down the country, it's emblematic of a lot of genuine issues that aren't getting addressed because nobody wants to be responsible for shaking up the delicate balance of prosperity. The same is true for the mining industry from earlier, and the real estate crisis that we still need.
Gambling is socially and culturally acceptable in Australia, whereas investing in a business seems to be frowned upon. If you put that same thousands of dollars a year into a small business as a young man, you're probably going to have to cop a lot of shit, a lot of haters, a lot of tall poppy syndrome who want to try and tear you down. It's such a shame. I know a lot of you won't believe me, but it's true. Whereas if you do that in the US or other countries that favor taking risks and putting yourself out there, you're still gambling on yourself. Would you rather be gambling on a business backed by your skills and experience, or a sports event that you actually have no control over?
There is nothing wrong with a country exporting its resources. The problem Australia has had is turning a revenue source that is good for Australia into money that is good for Australians. A lot of the revenue generated by mining in Australia has just been paid out to foreign mining companies in arrangements that are not that different from many exploited third world petrostates. Australia has tried in the past to generate more government revenue from its resources, but heavy lobbying won out, and people have been too afraid to try it again since the currency has been so dependent on these exports. In fact, the government has actually gone the other way and given hundreds of obscure grants, bonuses, deferments, schemes, and incentives to mining companies to help them along. According to the government's own minerals website, the intention of these schemes is for providing both commercial and operational advantages to investors. New government initiatives support the long-term sustainability of the Australian resources sector by de-risking and encouraging mineral exploration.
I think this is good. I don't think the government should be taxing or increasing royalties on resource businesses because they are driving the economy, and they're the ones taking the risk, investing capital to dig these resources up and ship them to their customers. Their shareholders have invested their capital. Australians have invested their capital in these businesses. It's those people's choice to do that. Instead of investing in unproductive real estate, they've chosen to take a risk and put it into an Australian business that has a competitive advantage of digging up iron ore, oil, gold, gas, and shipping it overseas. The government should not be taking that money. And if they are going to be taking that money, which they have done and they will continue to do, then they should be investing it in other areas of the economy wisely. Another example is the NBN, the National Broadband Network. So Australia has some of the worst internet in the world. For example, the internet in Malaysia is 10 times faster than it is in Australia. That's not a joke, it's absolutely true, and it's cheaper. So how can a country that people like you might say is less developed, how can it have significantly faster and higher quality internet than a first world country like Australia? Well, you might say Australia is spread out, yes, but the cities are not. Sydney, Melbourne is relatively dense. There's no reason why we can't have good internet. So what happened is $60-70 billion were earmarked in 2007-2008 for the National Broadband Network for fixed infrastructure. Now, by the time it's been built, it's been, 15, 16, 17 years since then. You could see that wireless technology, 5G, was clearly outpacing a national-wide fixed infrastructure. That's an example of taking money from mining and investing it somewhere with zero foresight. So while that infrastructure has been completed, it is completely inefficient. Australia still lags behind, and now you can get Starlink or other wireless technologies that give a much better service at potentially a cheaper price. So that's a good example of just poor capital allocation by the government. So I think companies that earn high returns on equity, high returns on capital, like some of these mining businesses, should attract and keep capital.
One of the country's biggest problems is that nobody wanted to invest anywhere else. So this does seem a bit strange. But destabilizing this source of foreign income could knock over other highly leveraged areas of the economy. So their government is trying to keep it running hot by whatever means necessary. Now, at this point you might be thinking, how the f did this place get so rich to begin with? Was it really just putting a bigger number on their homes and calling that wealth? Well, yes, but there actually is still one more thing. Australia has a system called superannuation, which is a special tax-advantaged investment vehicle that Australian workers can use to save and invest for their retirement.
Yeah, it's similar to a 401k in the US. So this is a mandatory payment that employers have to make into the employee's account. It can't be touched until you're 60, 65, depending on where you were born. So this way you have a lot of superannuation investment managers managing trillions of dollars of funds on behalf of Australians. So the idea here is to get them off the pension Ponzi scheme, because that's just unsustainable, like Social Security in the US. The unfunded liabilities are much higher than what could possibly be paid out. So that's just a system ready to collapse. So at least we have superannuation that's acquiring these funds on behalf of Australians for them to fund their retirement one day. But he may not mention this, but the government is coming after super as well, because so much money is there, they want a slice of it. So they're going to start trying to increase taxes, put limits on super. They're going to try and change the rules.
It's functionally similar to a 401k or an IRA, but the big difference is that employers must contribute a share of their employees' pay into their nominated account every year, instead of it being voluntary or offered as a part of their job package. The current contribution requirement is 11.5%, which means every Australian worker is effectively saving more than 10% of their income for retirement.
It's a significant amount and it's your money, so you're forcibly not able to access your money. So I can see the positives, that it does force saving and capital allocation towards retirement planning. However, for someone who is responsible and able to make their own investments and choices with their own money, you could look at it as government control over what your employer has to pay the employee. So is it really your money? It's to be seen.
Something like that would make even a lot of disciplined financial planners blush. The hope is that this money will eventually take the strain off the public-funded pensions as the Australian population gets older.
It has to. So Australia does have an aging population. The pension is only rising and it's costing the government a lot of money. So it's an unsustainable system. And what happens is, unfortunately, is that the pension is means tested, which means if you have a certain amount of assets to your name, you are then no longer eligible for the pension. So for example, if you had $500,000 in the bank, the government wouldn't pay you the pension. Fair enough. But what you may not know is that housing is not included in the asset test. So you could be sitting on a $20 million house and only have 20k in the bank, and therefore you would be getting the pension. So this is a complete fraud, and it encourages older people to just sit on their houses. They can have a 5-6 bedroom house for one person, and there's no incentive to sell it, because if they sell it and invest their capital where it would actually benefit the economy, such as other businesses, shares, or just any other form of capital, they would then lose the pension benefit. So there's this idea that no, I have to just sit everything in housing, even though it makes no sense.
And it has built some enormous fortunes. According to JP Morgan, the average Australian household now has the equivalent of almost $250,000 invested in just this one asset class, before including regular savings, investments, or home equity. The fact that it is mandatory and applied to all workers means that the concentration of retirement savings in the hands of already wealthy households isn't as high as it is here in America. This is genuinely an amazing financial tool, and you might be starting to notice a trend here. It has covered over a lot of other problems. Collectively, Australian superannuation is worth more than $2 trillion USD, which is only enough to buy 2/3 of Apple, but it has outgrown the Australian investment market because investment activity is just not as strong there. This means more and more of these retirement savings have been invested abroad, with the majority of that money ending up back here in the American markets.
It's interesting as well how the funds are invested. So a lot of the super funds are going to invest in the ASX 200, the Australian index, the S&P 500, basically the biggest companies in the world and in Australia, which are typically big banks which fund the mortgages for the properties, as well as mining companies. So what happens is that the bigger companies get bigger, because as more money gets taken out of your paycheck and put into your super account, it's invested in these funds, which then put that money into the shares of these big companies, the banks and the miners, and they just keep driving up the price. So this is why those industries just keep attracting more and more capital, and I'm seeing it as a cycle that's going to be very difficult to break away from.
Now, that alone is not a bad way to diversify risk outside of Australia. And yes, it's all getting pumped into the Magnificent Seven, but that's all investing these days. What could possibly go wrong? The real problem is that
Well, we've just seen what started to go wrong. So the Nasdaq is down about 10% over the last 2 days at the time of me filming this. Let's see if it bounces. This is a global phenomenon. In the US, the Mag 7, all the money is going into the bigger companies, making them bigger and bigger, which then decreases complexity of the economy and the stock markets, where you have concentrated wealth in these big names, and the smaller companies, the innovative companies that need this capital and have higher returns on equity, are missing out.
Australia is technically taking their cash, which is propped up by a mining industry, and then giving it to us so that we can build businesses here in America. A lot of Australian companies, which are not in the gaming, mining, or real estate industry, are actually choosing to raise investments and go public here in America instead. Simply because we have more investors that are willing to put money into companies that aren't in gambling, mining, or real estate.
That's a good point. So I've invested in some Australian tech companies and they're just not valued the same as the US market does. Australia doesn't have this capacity, this forward vision to value companies like this correctly in the tech industry.
But if the country was more accommodating of other investments, it could use a lot of this savings to make its people and itself wealthier and more productive. The wealth invested into the Australian superannuation system may also be very impressive, but it won't actually do much unless it can keep up with how expensive it is to live in Australia. A common strategy for Australian workers is to wait until they can access their retirement savings, take all of the money they accumulated over their working career, and use it to pay off their house. This is where we finally get to the elephant in the room: real estate. The cost of housing in Australia has made every single problem so far even worse.
What he just said then about acquiring this big super nest egg and then using it to pay down debt or spend it is fundamentally not a great way to incentivize how to live your life, because you're sacrificing your good years, you're sacrificing experiences. A big risk I see is actually people over saving, so that by the time they get to 65 and they actually access all the money they've accumulated throughout their life, they no longer have the health or the same drive to do what they once wanted to do. So you can almost fall into the trap of saving too much money. Not for everyone, but if you're on the ball, if you see what's happening, make sure you have enough for retirement, but do not go overboard because you'll miss out on life experiences today.
According to a broad market survey, the average age of a first home buyer in Australia is 36 years old. And the fastest growing group of people buying a home for the first time are those aged between 40 and 49. Homes are so expensive that they are usually taken on with a 30-year mortgage, and families will move into larger homes as they build up equity.
Yeah, I also want to challenge the idea of owning your home. So we're seeing here that the economy has changed. This is not just Australia, it's globally. The idea that you have to own a home is simply not the case and not worth the anxiety. So you can come to countries like Southeast Asia, Malaysia, you can rent an amazing luxury condo from just $500 a month. It's a bit of a fool's game to be pumping all this money into this big mortgage for a property that is realistically overvalued. Why? You don't need to own property. It doesn't have to be the Australian, the American dream. You can change it. Now we're seeing a lot of people want location independence. You do not get location independence by putting all your capital into one small building. Instead, you have that in an asset that gives you cash flow or gives you flexibility to live wherever you want.
So a lot of Australians are now getting to the age they would like to retire still in massive debt. Using the proceeds from superannuation to pay off their mortgage doesn't technically make them any poorer. They have just transferred retirement savings into real estate equity. But it does allow them to access the government's public old age pension, since it's not counted as an asset to assess if they have the ability to fund themselves.
So this is what I was talking about. So you can have $1 million in superannuation, but if you just drew money from that, you wouldn't be getting the pension. Whereas if you took that money out and therefore you have no money left, if you put it all into your house, you can still get the pension, which is absurd, because now you could have millions of dollars of equity in your house. But God forbid you sell the house, you keep the house, even if it's not efficient, even if it's got 6 rooms and you only need 1. Heaven forbid you have to live in an apartment and you keep getting the pension. And who's paying the pension? Workers who are now in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who are paying these high taxes, who cannot afford a house of their own, but they're paying your pension. Rip off.
Since paying a mortgage or rent normally takes up so much of people's budget there, giving up retirement savings often works out to be more financially responsible, because even a modest pension income can cover everything else as long as they have a paid off house to live in. For many households, this has made one of Australia's greatest wealth building tools just another way to prop up a real estate market that is already so expensive that the rest of the world should be afraid of it. But how did it get this bad in the first place? There is the usual combination of investor speculation, generous financing, NIMBYism, and high levels of migration into cities that couldn't expand fast enough.
NIMBYism is a big one. So NIMBY is not in my backyard. So you have property owners who benefit from certain zoning rules. So if you have a house and then the government said, oh, you can build an apartment building next door, that would drive the price of your house down because you're increasing supply to meet the demand, but then prices would go down. So all the property owners in that area will vote against the council's federal government against these types of zoning changes. You can have all that infrastructure, you can have all those nice apartments, but not in my backyard. And then if you have the whole country saying that, then the apartments, the additional supply never actually gets built because it's not politically favourable for a government to allow that.
But on top of that, Australia has added its own special ingredients. Taxes on earned income in Australia are some of the highest in the world. Someone earning the equivalent of just 120,000 American dollars a year would pay 45% on every additional dollar they earned after that.
Plus the Medicare levy of 2%. So healthcare in Australia is not free, and the tax rates are very high by global standards. So anything you think you're getting for free is costing you a lot in taxes.
And remember, Australia is not a cheap place to live. So even though that would be a very good salary for anybody, it's not actually going to go that far after tax is taken out. However, one of the unique features of Australia is the fact that personal investment losses, including paper real estate losses, can be used to write off personal income to reduce their tax. This effectively makes every person in Australia their own little business that can accrue expenses to offset their tax. And the best business to get into with the most possible expenses is real estate. This tax structure has encouraged high-income earners to favor investing in a real estate that they can use to make paper losses like depreciation to offset their income, and then turn highly taxed earned income into much more modestly taxed capital gain.
I agree with negative gearing. It is an actual loss, and depreciation and other maintenance costs, etc., interest costs on the mortgage are genuine expenses of making an investment, but the incentives need to be changed into investing in new supply, into new housing, rather than putting money into old housing, which isn't actually a productive investment. On the topic of capital gains, it also raises the question, if you were to invest in property versus shares, shares is obviously more attractive for the economy, new businesses that earn a return on that equity invested, but it doesn't make sense from a tax standpoint because not many people can borrow against shares to fund the investments. If you are, the interest rate on an equity loan is going to be 8 or 9% interest per annum, whereas a mortgage could be as low as 4 or 5% per annum. So if you're going to leverage up, it makes more sense in Australia to be investing in property and doing it that way. That's why people do it. Plus, it's easier to understand for most people that I buy a house price go up, I make money. Yay.
The system called negative gearing is almost universally agreed to be broken. It would be a lot easier to tax everybody at a lower rate and get rid of these write-offs. But it's been really hard to make that happen because they can't afford this house of cards to unravel. There is now so much debt and wealth tied up in Australian housing that the Australian economy could be wiped out by even the indication that the government could rein in these incentives. The same thing is happening with other less obvious policies as well. Immigration to Australia has been some of the most intense in the world, and the country has become highly dependent on low-income immigrants to do a lot of the jobs they aren't willing to.
Immigration is one of the most controversial issues that people would say is driving all these other problems. So this video is only going to touch on it very briefly. There's only a minute left, but immigration into Australia is huge. The numbers are massive, and it's different to someone coming and living in Southeast Asia or these countries because Australia makes it much easier for you to live there for years. It makes it much easier for you to get permanent residency. It makes it much easier for you to get citizenship. For example, in Malaysia, I will never be a PR. I will never be able to get citizenship.
And high-income immigrants to also buy into their asset market. According to Henley Partners, a law firm specializing in legal arrangements for high-net-worth immigrants, over 40% of the millionaires in Australia today were not born there. Some have, of course, gone there and made their fortunes, but most have just gone there and parked their fortunes that they already had.
A lot of this will be the Chinese contingent. So one thing politically with China is they want to get money out of the Chinese system. Wealthy people, they make their money in China, they want to get it out. So they find ways to come to Australia to buy property. They just tie it up in the property. They got $5 million. They just buy an overpriced place in the northern suburbs of Sydney and just let it sit there. They don't care about the return. They care about that their capital is safe as houses in a good jurisdiction that looks after housing like Australia.
In all of the biggest issues in the world today, Australia is a look at what 10 years from now could mean for us. And perhaps the biggest problem is that so far they have managed to keep everything on track.
Sydney CBD, which we're showing here, is actually now majority Asian in demographics, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but it has changed a lot over the last 20, 30 years. And part of that is because a lot of the universities here, which foreign students come here to study and then work and then get PR and then get citizenship, buy houses and property in these areas. So you're seeing a lot of Asian immigration and influence into Sydney, particularly, also Melbourne.
But there is a difference between success and delayed consequences. Australia has some of the most valuable banking institutions in the world, but most of their books are tied up in lending to an overvalued real estate market. Workers are getting taxed heavily while dealing with declining real income.
Yeah, so it's a house of cards because the superannuation funds, which was touched on before, invest in the banks, which provide the mortgages for people to buy the properties. So if the properties are overpriced, that came down because of these negative gearing, tax changes or whatever else, increased supply. That would then impact their ability to pay the mortgages or the equity in those homes banks have on their books, which would affect the share price of the banks, which are probably 2 times the global average in terms of valuation. So if the bank shares were to halve, then that would seriously impact the Australian stock market and superannuation savings, which would then have a massive impact on the whole net worth of Australians. How real is the median wealth that a lot of Australians are sitting on? My advice might be to look at your wealth and what can you do with it now before the house of cards falls apart. Can you take this money? Can you live a better life overseas, in Asia, in Malaysia, in a country of your choice? Now is the time to be looking at a backup option, in my opinion.
Businesses are finding it too expensive to operate there, and all of the wealth in the world, paper or otherwise, doesn't mean anything if it can only buy you a 1-bedroom apartment 2 hours from anywhere. Now, if you are an Australian and this was all a bit depressing for you, it could be worse. You could be from the UK.
Love it. So you guys know Daryl on my channel. He's from the UK. His whole channel is about leaving the UK. So they tell me how miserable it is. My family, my grandparents are from the UK as well. There's a reason they come to Australia. Australia is in a better spot than countries like the UK and maybe America if you're watching this, in your opinion. We'll end the video there and I'll sum it up with my honest thoughts. It was a good video from an American perspective, looking at a few of the different issues affecting Australians and the Australian economy. It rightly pointed out that the Australian economy is very simple and it relies primarily on housing and exporting resources. It also touched on the gambling, which is interesting. I think that's a little bit overstated. I don't think that's as big of a problem as they made it out to be in terms of the whole economy. I'm sure gaming and gambling is actually a small percentage of the economy in the schemes of things, but it does highlight where the money is going in Australia rather than investments in technology or other innovative things. We actually just want to roll TikTok and put bets on sport. It also covered high taxes, which is absolutely the case. Australia does have high taxes and you would be right to be looking at other options, looking at tax effective structures such as investing in property with negative gearing, investing in fully franked dividends, moving your money overseas, moving your tax structures for your business overseas if you have significant money or income from that, but that's not going to be the average person. For the average person, consider how your superannuation in Australia is invested, because in the long run, even if you can't or don't buy a house, your super is going to form the bulk of your net worth over time, and particularly when you retire. If you're in your 30s or 40s like me, you will not be getting the pension at 65 no matter what. The pension will not be a thing in 20 years time, in my opinion. There's just too much cost to that and the country's simply not going to be able to afford it. We also need to hope that commodity prices stay high so they can generate the tax revenues for the government to offset a lot of the spending that they're wasting everywhere else. Overall, that was an excellent video and I hope I was able to give you some unique insights. This was particularly focused on Australia, not so much Asia and the rest of the world. If you're interested in hearing more about my life as an Australian in Malaysia and the rest of Asia, subscribe to my channel and I'll see you in the next one.